you so much. That was such a lovely, lovely introduction. And it's just great to see so many people here. So can you, I'm going to share my screen. So can you see that? Thumbs up. And so I'm so excited to be with you. I think I'd rather be in Orange County than in Washington, D.C. at the moment, but it's exciting to be with you to talk about my book, America's Jewish Women. As Ari said, I'm right now working on a book on American anti-Semitism, and I haven't thought about the America's Jewish Women book for a little while, so it's very, very exciting for me to kind of like come back and think about that some more. So what I'm going to do is something that's a little unusual for an academic. I'm going to start by showing you some family photos. Okay, so here we go. This woman is my great-grandmother. And if you look at this image, you look very carefully at her hairline, you will see that she is wearing a sheitel. The wig an observant married Jewish woman would have worn in the first decade of the 20th century when this photo was taken, and the wig that many observant married Jewish women will continue to wear down until today. And when I saw this image the first time I saw it, I thought, she looks so old-fashioned. And I actually know, because when I was on book tour in person, I was talking with someone who got a PhD in costume design, and she told me that the dress my grandmother is wearing went out of style in 1870. But she's wearing this in the beginning of the 20th century. So now we see another image taken at the very same time. This is my grandmother, and so she is very she. She's got, the great thing about Zoom is you can really see the slides. This is like the best part of Zoom. So she's got not only a bow in her hair, but she's got bows on her shoes. And the dress that she is wearing was called a lingerie or a linen dress. And it was only in style between 1903 and 1910. So I know she was she because that's about the time that this was taken. So in this next image, it's a park on a warm spring day in Newark, New Jersey, and the woman with her back to us is my mother. And she is wearing what she told me she always wore when she went to the park, a white blouse and a black pencil skirt, which, by the way, the Israeli translator did not know how to translate. He actually kind of wrote black pencil and then skirt, and of course that was not how it was supposed to be translated. And if you look really closely at my mother and at this little thing over her shoulder, you could kind of see there's a baby's bonnet peeking out, and that's me. So I didn't bring a photo of me because you can see me, but I will tell you that I'm wearing what I've worn for my entire academic career, and that is some form of a black jacket, because that has been my uniform as a female professor. But I brought a photo of my daughter, and here she is, and she's wearing, this is either at the end of undergraduate or maybe when she was already in medical school, but she's wearing a short skirt. She's taking a selfie, and I'm going to come back to technology, so pay attention to that. And she's taking a selfie, and she's wearing tall boots. So I said to her when I was putting together the slides, I said, Orly, I really need a photo of you to use in my book talk. And she said, Mom, you can have this one, but you have to tell everybody that the boots are yours. I have never seen those boots again. So for every woman on here who has ever lost a piece of clothing to a child, we have the same experience. But the point is, and what am I doing talking about clothing and introducing a book about America's Jewish women? But as I looked at these photos that are in my home, I was thinking about how much not only had their clothing changed, but their lives had changed. So think about this for a minute. My great-grandmother was one of more than 2 million Jews who came from Eastern Europe to America at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. She had one very particular kind of life and was still wearing that sheitel that we saw. Her daughter, my grandmother, raised her children in the Great Depression. And that meant that she had a very different kind of life than her mother or than her daughter, my mother, because my mother came of age shortly after World War II. And she had what I think of as a very kind of typical life for Jewish women in those years. She graduated high school. She had a few years of college. She got married. She was working as a secretary, but then after she got pregnant, she stopped to raise the children of the baby boom. And when it was time to go back to work after those children were old enough, she went back to work first as what by then was called an administrative assistant. We didn't have secretaries any longer. And then eventually became a real estate agent and worked into her 80s. I rode the coattails of a revolution I did not make. And that revolution is what led me into my career of decades in academia, in the professoriate. And as I said, that same revolution opened up the doors that allowed my daughter to enter medical school, and not just to become a physician, but actually, and here I am bragging, I know, sorry about it, but she's actually a surgeon, which never, ever would have happened before that revolution had taken place. So the point is, okay, clothing changed. We know something about how their lives changed, but I wanted to know so much more. I wanted to know what was different about how they raised their families, what was different about the size of their families, what was different about where they lived, because there were places that my grandmother and my great-grandmother and even my mother, there were neighborhoods they could never have moved into. I didn't face that. My daughter hopefully won't face that. I wanted to know what was different about the kinds of work that they did, which I've already hinted at a little bit. I wanted to know how technology had changed their lives. So if we were in person, I would ask you to tell me what's going on in this photo. Maybe some of you will know. Here is a woman in the Lower East Side of New York in the second decade of the 20th century, and she's doing laundry. This is how laundry was done. And so the first thing I want to say is we're pretty sure the photo was staged, because I like to think that she probably wouldn't have been stirring that hot pot on the cooktop with the dirty clothes in it and holding the baby at the very same time. And I look at this and I get nervous. The little boy in the front, maybe a little girl, was looking out at the photographer. And she's also actually dressed too well for somebody who was doing laundry, because she's got spats on. The shoes she's wearing is probably not what she would have worn. So think about what it took to do laundry. Now she's really lucky. She's got water in that kitchen. You can see the taps, and she can fill that heavy pot. But then she's got to get the clothes. She's got to dump them in the pot. She's got to wash them. She's got to rinse them. She's got to haul wet laundry up to the roof. You know how heavy wet laundry is when it comes out of the machine. She's got to haul it up to the roof, hang it out to dry, hope it doesn't rain, and then bring it back down and either fold it or maybe even it needed ironing. I find the notion of doing laundry like this utterly mind-boggling. And I want you to know that electric washing machines were not invented until the beginning of the 20th century. It was this kind of home labor that really dictated patterns of women's lives. So most of all, when I leave behind those big categories we talked about, I wanted to know what it meant to these women to be Jewish women, because the women in my family are Jewish and the women I write about are Jewish. And I like to think that being Jewish defined so many aspects of their lives. It wasn't only that there was a group of Jewish women who would move from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday, whose kitchens were Jewish, whose neighborhoods were Jewish, who really lived ensconced in a Jewish world. Those women, I see Judaism as really defining their lives. But there's a huge swath of America's Jewish women for whom I see Jewishness as more than Judaism determining their lives. It would determine, obviously, whether they had a Passover Seder, whether they might have gone to synagogue on Yom Kippur. Maybe it didn't determine what they ate in their kitchens. By now, they would have broken, certainly by the 20th century, they would have broken with keeping kosher. But being Jewish would have actually determined how much education these women got, because Jewish women have been disproportionately better educated than all the rest of American women for more than a century. And so it determined that. It also determined, at least certainly well into the 1970s, who they married. Jewish women were far more likely to marry other Jews. So Jewishness set a lot of the patterns of their lives. But then there's a whole nother group of Jewish women for whom being Jewish was so incidental that they didn't pay very much attention to it. But every once in a while, they would bump up against somebody who knew that they were Jewish, and they would discover that it mattered a lot. So here's how I like to think of being Jewish. If you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. So this is going to take us into where I open the book with something about kind of putting up a pair of two women who will guide us into this narrative. So I imagine that none of you have ever heard of Grace Nathan, unless you've actually read the book. But take a look at Grace Nathan's dates. She was born in 1752 and she died in 1831. If you know your American history, think about what she lived through. She lived through the Revolutionary War. She lived through the Declaration of Independence. She lived through the Constitution, the War of 1812. But when she writes her letters that she left in her archives, and also some poetry that she wrote, what does she write about? She writes about a niece who has been spitting up blood for a few months. But the doctors are not terribly worried. They think her corsets are too tight. Clothing matters. Now, this woman, maybe some of you will recognize. I'm seeing a couple of nods. It's Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus, of course, had a very, very different life from Grace Nathan, because she didn't leave her poetry in the archives. She actually left her poem, the New Colossus, in the base of the Statue of Liberty. It welcomes the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to America. But what I bet most of you don't know is that Grace Nathan was Emma Lazarus's great-grandmother. So here we have two women from one family, and they lived their lives as women, as Americans, and as Jews. And the astonishing thing is that they used America's freedoms to actually check.
I don't think it's just me, but I think the speaker is frozen. Do you all agree? Okay. I will tell her. Hold on.
Am I frozen? Am I back? Am I back?
You're back. You were frozen for about 10 seconds.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. So all right, I hope I don't freeze again. I think my husband just went on the internet downstairs also. So let me tell you about Emma Lazarus. So she wrote a poem that called In Exile, where she imagines her ancestors trudging out of Spain and coming to this wonderful country that gave her the freedom to live under Moses's law. And then she added, and to think the thoughts Spinoza taught. So if in the many hundreds of programs you have had, you might have heard a program about Benedict de Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, you might know that Spinoza was a 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher whose ideas about biblical criticism were so heretical that he got kicked out of the Jewish community. He was actually formally excommunicated, and he was so good in Hebrew that he offered the rabbis who were excommunicating him, he offered to help them with his excommunication certificate. He would help them write it in Hebrew. But the point is that Spinoza was thrown out of the Jewish community, But Emma Lazarus is claiming him. And to do that in the 1870s, when she wrote that poem, or the early 1880s, when she did that, that was the work of a maverick, a radical, somebody who was out to change what it meant to be a Jew. The stunning thing is that her very pious, very observant great-grandmother, Grace Nathan, I mean, you can even see how she's dressed so modestly here. Grace Nathan was also a Jewish maverick. Towards the end of her life, she wrote an ethical will. Maybe some of you know what ethical wills are. They're where you leave your life's lessons to your descendants. So in her ethical will to her only child that we know of, maybe there were ones that didn't, who died too soon to be recorded, to her only son, she told us, she said to him, "At my death, only keep your beard for 7 days." If you know a Jewish tradition, you know that it is customary for a man not to shave for a minimum of 30 days following the death of a parent. Some Jewish men don't shave for an entire year. These two Jewish women, mavericks changing Judaism, showed the possibilities for how America's Jewish women would leave their impact on our nation, as Emma Lazarus did with the New Colossus poem, and on Jewish life in the United States. So I'm going to leave that world behind, and we're going to go back into colonial days. We're going to go back to Abigail Levy Franks, who we see here. When Abigail was 7 years old, she sailed from London with her father and came to live in New York City. And the reason we know so much about her is that she married Jacob when she was just 16. They immediately, within a year, she gave birth to the first of her, I think it was 7 children, maybe a little bit more than that. She didn't hold the record, by the way, for a colonial Jewish woman having children. That record was held by Rebecca Machado Phillips of Philadelphia. She had 21 children, and she almost ran out of names from the Bible to give to them. So Abigail's first child, her son Naphtali, when he was maybe 17 or 18, he sailed to England to live with his father's brother and to enter in the family's transatlantic trading business. And she wrote him a treasure trove of letters. They're amazing, amazing letters that were preserved. His responses to her we don't have. They were not preserved. But it's from them that we know so much about Abigail's world. And so, for example, in one of the letters, she writes to him and she says she knows that her brother is also living in London, and she doesn't trust her brother to keep a kosher kitchen. So she says to him, "Never eat anything at my brother's home except for bread and butter." So we know she's pretty observant. We also learn something astonishing, because Abigail began to chafe against a lot of Jewish traditions. And she writes, this is in the 1730s, she writes that if a Calvin or a Luther would rise amongst us, I would be the first of their followers. Can you imagine this? Here is this observant Jewish woman, almost a century before Reform Judaism takes off in Europe, and she is calling for a reformer like John Calvin or Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformers, to come to Judaism and get rid of its idol superstitions and idol ceremonies. It's a stunning statement. But she also learns the price of that impulse, because when she discovered that her daughter Phila had intermarried with the Protestant Oliver Delancey, she wrote that her spirit was so crushed, she never wanted to see or speak with anyone again. And we actually don't know if she ever reconciled with Phila, because one of the few letters we have from Jacob is about trying to get mother and daughter to reconcile. So I mention this because we always think that intermarriage became really a major factor of American Jewish life in the late 20th century. but it's already there in colonial days. So I'm going to skip over a lot of years because Ari didn't think I can get through to the 21st century, but Ari, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to jump past the world of Grace Nathan, past the world of Emma Lazarus, and I introduce Rosa Sonnenschein. So when in the 1860s, Rosa Sonnenschein, by then she had 3 children, came to America from Central Europe with her husband, Rabbi Solomon Sonnenschein. And they settled in St. Louis. I don't know if anybody from St. Louis is on here. And they settled there where he became rabbi of the leading Reform congregation. And Rosa Sonnenschein did what a good rabbi's wife should do. So the first thing she did was she gave birth to the 4th of her 4 children. Family size has gotten smaller. Then she does something that also makes her a maverick. In 1879, she founded the first Jewish women's book club in America. How many of you are members of book clubs? Anybody on here? Oh, I'm seeing a whole bunch of hands, right? Okay, I don't know how long yours has been meeting. Hers has been meeting since 1879. It is still meeting today in St. Louis. And then, so that makes her an innovator. But then she did something that also made her a maverick. In 1892, she walked out on her husband. The marriage had been miserable for ages. She waited for the kids to grow up. And in these years, you needed grounds to get divorced in the United States. So she gave him grounds to divorce her because she walked out on him. So now she's stuck because she's got to earn a living because he's not going to pay her any alimony, that's for sure. So she created the first English language Jewish women's magazine in the United States, and she called it the American Jewess. Now, some of you may have heard the term Jewess used sardonically. It fell out of fashion in the 1940s. I've seen people try to bring it back in the 21st century, but in the 1890s, when she was publishing this, Jewess was how Jewish women and Jewish men and Gentile men and women called American Jewish women. And in the magazine, she starts spotlighting extraordinary changes in American Jewish life. For example, she writes about the founding of the first of what I now call the powerhouse Jewish women's organizations, the National Council of Jewish Women, founded in 1893 by this woman, Hannah Solomon. And I love this other photo here because what we see are the members of the National Council of Jewish Women. They have come to the White House because even before women could vote across the United States, they had entered into politics. They decided to combat the international traffic in white slavery, which was the term used back then to talk about rings of criminals who captured young girls and women and tricked them into false marriages or raped them and sent them to brothels in Buenos Aires and Istanbul. And this was one of the major foci of the National Council of Jewish Women in its early years. Here's another powerhouse Jewish organization that was founded again in this period, this time in the second decade of the 20th century. We have Hadassah emerges in 1912. It would eventually become the largest Jewish women's organization in the United States. But in 1912, it was a tiny organization, yet it had enough funds to hire 2 nurses that you see in this picture and send them to Jerusalem, where in 1913, they hung out a sign saying Nurses Settlement and Daughters of Hadassah, and they saw 5,000 patients in the first year. They were shut down during World War II World War I when the war broke out in 1914, but eventually Hadassah would make it its prime mission to establish health care in the Jewish community in Palestine, in the Yishuv. It served Arabs and Jews. And at the founding of the state, Hadassah would turn this network of clinics and the first hospital over to the state, but continue to make healthcare one of its prime areas of philanthropy. But Jewish women didn't only need a large organization to be activists. In 1902, on the Lower East Side of New York, when the price of kosher meat soared from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound, housewives, immigrant housewives in their 30s and 40s took to the streets. That's what we see here. They broke into butcher shops. They threw the meat into the streets. They would douse it with kerosene, sometimes set it aflame, and they declared a kosher meat boycott until the price of the meat would come down. It was eventually successful. It did come down, but we see these women organizing because they needed every single penny to feed their families and clothe their children and themselves and their husbands. And the full story is actually told in a book that came out after mine, Scott Seligman's The Great Kosher Meat Boycott. And if you haven't had him out, you should definitely have him out. He gives a great lecture on it. But Jewish women were not only interested in Jewish things, right? Of course not. So here we see, this photo came into my possession not long, like a couple of years after I had worked on the book. And I love this image. Here is a suffragette, Sophia Lobinger. And imagine she is standing atop a stepladder in a crowded sea of men. And she can't just be in a soapbox because she's too high up. And look at that image. There's not a woman in that crowd. It's 1910, and she has waded into that sea of men to tell them in New York that they should give women the right to vote. Of course, women don't win the right to vote in New York until 1917, and they don't win it in the nation until 1920. But as much as I'm interested in all these political changes, I was also interested in what was going on in the home. So this is my all-time favorite memoir, Kate Simon's Bronx Primitive. I think it won the National Book Award the year it came out, or it was a finalist for it. Kate Simon eventually became a professor at Hunter College. And she was a travel writer. And then in the 80s, she began writing 3 very small volumes of memoirs. And this is the first. She was an immigrant, came to America in the 20s. So she got out after World War I out of Europe, settled in the Bronx. And she describes what happens in her house on the eve of every Sabbath. So starting on Friday afternoon, her mother would polish the furniture with lemon oil, and she would make gefilte fish. And then she would, as the Sabbath descended, she would light the candles, she would cover her hair, and she would make the blessing. But then Kate Simon says one Sabbath, in the middle of the blessing, her mother blew out the candles, tore off her headcloth, turned to her family and said, "No more, never again. I'm not going to do this, and I don't have to do it because my mother's not here to make me." And according to Kate Simon, her mother never again lit Sabbath candles, but the house still smelled of lemon oil and gefilte fish on Sabbath eves. And it's a powerful lesson in how Jewish women changed traditions, made traditions, preserved traditions in Judaism in America. But while all of this is going on, there was another way in which Jewish women were activists. Maybe some of you have heard of Edna Ferber. She wrote Showboat, she wrote Giant. These were major hits as novels. She won prizes. I think she won a Pulitzer, actually. Both Showboat and Giant were made into popular movies. Were actually also made into musicals. And Edna Ferber was a guest in the 1930s, early 1930s, at a Michigan industrialist's home. She was invited for a soiree. It was his country house, so everybody would be staying overnight. And they sit down to dinner, and their host starts talking about money-grubbing Jews controlling the world. And Ferber looks at the people around the table as they all start agreeing with the host. And she says to them, I am a Jew. And she said she never saw such hatred on the people across the table and next to her that she had ever seen in that moment. That night, when she went to her room, she not only locked the door, she put a chair against it. So she is one of many women who encountered anti-Semitism across American history and then stood up and fought back. And when I was, I don't think I realized as I was writing the book how much anti-Semitism figured in it until I was in a conversation with somebody who's a scholar of anti-Semitism, and he said it's all over the book. He kind of pushed me in the direction of the book I'm currently writing. So I'm going to skip World War II, although I don't in the book. I talk about Jewish women who went to war. But I want to turn to the 50s because we have this like very interesting image of the 50s. And I apologize, that's my dog that just decided to kind of shake in the back. So Jewish women were making headlines in the 50s, like really kind of amazing. So this one, let's see. Okay, so you recognize Bess Myerson, right? First and only Jewish woman ever to become Miss America, 1945. When she won the pageant in Atlantic City, people in the crowd and in the audience yelled Mazel Tov. Bess Myerson paid a price for being a Jew. 3 of the 5 sponsors of the Miss America pageant refused to use her to promote their products. Instead, she spent a good part of her year as Miss America speaking for the Anti-Defamation League. Now, this woman, some of you may recognize Dr. Joyce Brothers. Maybe some of you remember the name Dr. Joyce Brothers. She eventually became a radio and television psychologist. But in the 1950s, Dr. Joyce Brothers, who was already unusual, she had a PhD, she was married to a physician who had gotten a residency. Physician residents don't make very much money. They didn't make it back then. I can tell you they don't make very much back today. They couldn't live on just one salary. But she had a child and wanted to stay home to raise the child of the baby boom. So they decide together that she's really smart, which they know. So she memorizes a boxing manual, and she manages to get herself on one of those newfangled TV shows called the $64,000 Question as a boxing expert. And she won not $64,000, but $128,000, and eventually then would go on to have a career as a famous television and radio psychologist. I actually thought it would be fun to write a biography of her, but there are so many hours of footage to watch that I gave up because I don't want to sit there and watch all that footage. So there's another woman making headlines in these years, Ruth Handler. Ruth Handler invented the Barbie doll. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that Ruth Handler had 2 children. You can guess their names, Barbara and Ken. She was pretty audacious. She was inspired to make Barbie by seeing a doll in Europe that she and her daughter Barbara had seen when they had traveled there. And she actually at one point said, I thought little girls should play with dolls that had breasts. So she's making headlines. And this couple are also making headlines, although in a different way. This is Carole King, born Carol Klein. And she and her husband, Jerry Goffin, although before he was her husband, had written a song called Will You Love Me Tomorrow? And the reason they're getting married is because she's pregnant. What are the choices Jewish women have if they find themselves in the family way in the 1950s? They can get a very dangerous illegal abortion that might kill them or might send the abortionist to jail, because even physicians were sent to jail for abortions. She could go away to the Louise Waterman Wise home in New York City, have the baby and give it up for adoption, or she could marry the father or someone else who would have her. So in this case, she married Jerry Goffin. And the last of the women making headlines in these years was Betty Friedan. You've heard of the feminine mystique. She wrote it in 1963, but in the 50s, she was a journalist. She had been working as a journalist. The feminine mystique leads us to think that Betty Friedan was actually, just a bored housewife, but she was not a bored housewife. She was actually an activist and actually writing for a left-wing, the newspaper of a left-wing union. So my point about these women is, yes, they're all Jewish. They're completely different from one another. But the fact that their names are in the news gives the lie to this image. This image, which is in the National Museum, Weizmann National Museum now of American Jewish History, shows the women who have given birth to the baby boom in the 1950s, pushing those boomers into the future. I do like to remind you, however, that mothers pushing baby carriages have an awful lot of time to think, and together, the women in those pushing the carriages and those little girls sitting in them would, in the 60s, make that revolution whose coattails I and my daughter have followed. But the 50s are so much more complex than we remember. So the first thing is, coming into America are tens of thousands of Holocaust refugees. Here's one, Luba Bot, that I decided to spotlight. Luba Bot had been a nurse in Poland. She had survived the destruction of the ghetto. She was captured by the Gestapo. She was beaten, but she would not say that she was a Jew because they captured her outside the ghetto. So they sent her to Auschwitz anyway, but as a Polish political prisoner, not as a Jew, where in all likelihood she would have been murdered immediately. And so she eventually came to America. 2 weeks after she got here, one of her relatives said, "Tell me everything that happened to you and then don't speak of it ever again." I don't know if she ever spoke of it again, but she wrote 2 volumes of memoirs reciting what I just told you and more, and left them in the archives in Israel at the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem. In the 50s also are the years when the trial and then the execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg sent a Cold War chill across American Jews who had for decades flirted, if not directly embraced, the politics of the left. And finally, it's also in the 50s when women like Jerry Thayer left their families behind and went to hang out in the lesbian clubs of Greenwich Village. We tend to think of the Stonewall Revolution of 1968 launching the gay rights movement, but there's already an active gay rights scene in America, or gay scene in America, and Jewish women were a part of that back then too. So when we transition to the 60s, here's what I like to think of. Maybe some of you remember the invention of these. Frozen TV dinners are invented in the 1950s. I certainly grew up eating them. It's back to my point about technology. This was going to make life easier. I don't think it made it quite as easier as the washing machine did, but it certainly made it easier. And when we think of the images of the 60s, these are the images that jump out, right? The Vietnam War, the Beatles, Mao Zedong, the Kennedy assassination. When we think of women, Jewish women in the 60s, or women in the 60s, this is what we think of. Women on the march, creating that revolution. So I don't have enough time to tell you about all the women who play powerful roles in the women's rights movement in America. Jewish women were disproportionately represented in its leadership. This woman, Gerda Lerner, maybe you haven't heard of her, she survived the Nazi annexation of Vienna, of Austria in 1938. They imprisoned her and her mother under horrific conditions to pressure her father to give over his property, and she and her mother escaped. Gerda came to America. Her mother decided she couldn't start over in America, so her mother went to France, where she was eventually murdered by the Nazis. But in her 40s, Gerda Lerner got a PhD in history And in the 1970s, she began lobbying her adopted country to create a Women's History Week. Now, March is Women's History Month. The feminist revolution also changed American Judaism. This is one of my all-time favorite photos. Take a look at the woman who is sitting to your left next to the rabbi, right? Can you see her? The woman, let's see if I can, over here. So to the rabbi's right, but to our left. This is Ruth Bader at her confirmation class. I like to say this is Ruth Bader Ginsburg at her confirmation and not at her confirmation hearings. It's an amazing image to see because that's what synagogues used to look like back in the 50s, 60s. This is what they look like today. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to tell you one more story. But just for a second, just indulge me. We went from colonial days up to the 21st century. We saw Jewish women who were activists, who were observant, but who were changing Judaism. We saw those for whom Jewishness led them into Jewish organizations. And we met women like Edna Ferber, for whom being Jewish was so inconsequential that they could start spouting anti-Semitism and not realize they were doing it in front of a Jew. So I'm going to tell you one more story. Do you remember in the 1970s and 80s that when boys and girls were having their B'nai Mitzvah in synagogues, they would often be twinned with a Jewish child in the Soviet Union who couldn't have their bar or bat mitzvah? See a couple of nods, okay? So I found a letter in the archives from a North Miami Beach teenager writing to her Soviet twin saying, did you get my letters and the stationery I sent you? Because this particular twin liked to collect stationery. So I did what any good historian today does. I went on Facebook looking for the twin and I found her in Jerusalem. And I said, did you get those letters and that stationery? And she said she had no memory of getting them. Actually, the Soviet twins actually had lots of American twins. There were too many American twins and not enough Soviet twins. So I said, well, are you by any chance Facebook friends with this particular American bat mitzvah twin? And she said no, that she and Sheryl Sandberg, who was CEO of Facebook, are not Facebook friends, although they had been bat mitzvah twins, but that her father and Sandberg's mother are Facebook friends. And it's a great place to end a talk about the changes in America's Jewish women's life that will take us into the future, because the next historian is going to have to be reading Facebook posts. And I didn't have to do that for this book. So we have time for questions, I think, right?
Thank you. You did do it. You took us from colonial times to almost, well, actually to today. You did it. You did it. People have been posting questions that I've been looking at while you've been talking. So here are some of the questions. People want to know how long it took you to do all the research for this book, because it seems like an immense task.
Oh, it was. The day that I met, it actually took me about a quarter of a century. I mean, I was thinking about this book for a long, long time. The day I sent it off to my editor, my daughter posted on Instagram a photo of the two of us together when she was 4 years old. And she said, my mom finally did it. She finally finished the book. So yeah, long time.
Was this hard to get published?
Oh no! By the time I actually had a lot of interest in different publishers over the years that I kept saying I was writing it, but I had high aspirations. I really wanted to move. I don't know how much you know about publishing. There are academic presses, and the average academic press book sells about 400 copies, and there are trade presses. And I really wanted to try and get a trade press, and I was very lucky as I was. By the time I had about 4 chapters written, I got an agent who believed in me, and he sent it out, and I had a lot of rejections, and then my editor Amy Cherry at Norton took it, and Norton has just taken my next book. I didn't even shop it anywhere else, so they're a great press to work with.
Did you do lots of interviews for the book, or was it mostly research, reading online?
It's a combination. It's not that I didn't, first of all, because there's so little material that I could include from after World War II. I did not do lots of interviews. But everything that I've learned over that past quarter century informed what I would write about. I mean, it just, one day it dawned on me, how do you start the book? And I was looking at the photos and I said, oh my gosh, look at that. Their clothing has changed so much. That's a great way to get in. So I didn't do lots of interviews. I have been, and let me put this out to your audience. I have been, for my next book on encounters with anti-Semitism, I have been collecting stories. If you have a memory of an encounter with anti-Semitism, please, I'm gonna put my email right here in the chat. Send it to me in an email and give me permission to use it. I've gotten some astonishing stories. American Jews, and I actually probably think Jews across time, their lives are shaped by encounters with anti-Semitism. May not remember it, or you kind of live with it in the background for half a century, and then it crops up. So if you have memories, send them my way.
People have been saying such nice things about your presentation. They want to know what you teach at American University and what kinds of students you have.
So I have great students at American University. We've become quite selective in recent years. I teach a freshman seminar called Anti-Semitism Enduring Hatred. I teach a survey, a full semester survey of American Jewish history. I actually also teach the history of the Holocaust, which is something that I don't write about except from the American perspective, but I have taught for a long time. So those are some of the courses I teach.
And do your students tend to be mostly Jewish, or do you have a lot of non-Jewish students taking
No,
this class?
it's a real mix. Freshman students have to take a seminar and they have to select it, and I certainly will get, I think, more Jewish students in a class than somebody else, but never more than half the class. I don't think it's ever more than half.
We've done many programs. I mean, 509 online and more than 500 before that. And when we learn about about American history, let's say civil rights and the role that Jews have played, one of the things that, Professor Mark Dollinger, for example, his perspective, and I want to know what yours is not that, I don't think he said the Jews were disproportionately involved in civil rights. The Jews were involved, but he said whatever was going on in American history, the Jews tended to be affected by and involved with. So it wasn't that the Jews led civil rights, but when it happened, they got involved. But I believe you argued that the Jewish women were disproportionately involved in certain things. And is that a difference then?
I think so. I'm not saying they were disproportionately involved with civil rights. I think Mark, by the way, is totally on target here. For a long time, historians would say Jews were disproportionately involved in the civil rights movement in the United States. I think they were disproportionately involved compared to their size in the population, but not in terms of the broad mass. But when it comes to the women's movement, what I did say was Jewish women were disproportionately involved in the leadership. And it really touches me that you open this by dedicating this to Bella Abzug, because here's a perfect example. I actually wrote an article about her about last year or the year before. She would have been 100 years old, and I wrote it on the anniversary of what would have been her 100th birthday. But there are some reasons for this. The first reason is that Jewish women came to the women's movement in two ways. Some of them came to it because they experienced discrimination as Jews in their synagogue. Betty Friedan writes about this. Betty Friedan, she writes about being aware of the way in which women were othered, like they couldn't have roles in the synagogue. But they also, and this is also Friedan, Friedan was, when she was in high school, she didn't get into a sorority. It was and it's because she was Jewish. She grew up in Peoria, Illinois, and it was such a powerful experience for her that it ended up in her New York Times obituary. So Jewish women are sort of pushed to feminism, both because of discrimination in Judaism and then discrimination as Jews. So it's as women, but as Jews. But then there's that other reason. Remember I said about Jewish women being disproportionately better educated? So which pushes them to leadership or enables them to enter into leadership. So Jewish women went to college. So obviously I've been a professor for 40 years. I do think it matters what you learn in college. You learn how to speak, you learn how to read, you learn how to think, you learn how to be critical. And frankly, in the 60s, you also learned how to run a mimeograph machine. And those were skills that the movement needed. So I'm not saying Jewish women were disproportionately represented in the rank of file of the feminist movement in the United States, but the number of Jewish women in its leadership, in all sectors of its leadership, is astonishing. And that's because they were Jews.
Do you feel bad about leaving certain people out of your book that were Jewish women?
Oh,
that
yeah.
you kind of like that you would say, if I wrote part 2, these are anybody you want to mention that we should know about? Because you've told people we know about, but people also we probably didn't know about today. So is there?
So yes, definitely. I did not write about Jewish women in popular culture. There was no way I could. I had a word limit, and I could not get them in. The New York Times did a lovely review of my book, and the one criticism was that I gave Barbra Streisand one sentence. I actually gave her about a paragraph, but yeah, so I could live with that. But yeah, I mean, there were so many, and I actually did write. I have a piece online called Feminism, American Style, Jewish Women and the Making of a Revolution, which has a lot of the women I wanted to include in the book in that piece online, an academic piece.
And who are Jewish women we should know of today? I mean, you mentioned Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's no longer with us, but she would be an example.
Right. There are so many that it is impossible to name. It really depends on what part of the world you're interested in. If you're interested in the arts, so you want to know about Mila Kunis, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. If you're interested in literature, you should know about Taffy. Is it Taffy Brodesser Akner? Do I have the right name? She wrote a really great novel about a year or two ago. Really, I mean, there are Jewish women in the forefront of the sciences, of medicine. There are Jewish women who have been university presidents. It's Amy. I forgot her last name. It was president at Penn. In the professions, Jewish women excel in the professions and in culture.
And just in our last few minutes, people have asked, since you're writing a book about anti-Semitism, if you've watched the new Ken Burns series, and if you have any thoughts on that.
I did. I thought it was brilliant. I'm moderating a program next week with Sarah Botstein, who's one of the producer directors, and 2 of the historians that I know who are on camera. That was based, if you get to Washington, that is based on an exhibit called Americans and the Holocaust that's at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in its temporary exhibition space. It's excellent. I thought this was fabulous, just so well done and unexpected, because I don't think people expect to see a series like that'll have it's almost like chapter by chapter, right? What's going on in America, what's going on in Germany, and going back and forth. And at the end of the film, he's sending a very powerful message. So I hope people will listen to it.
Right. There was a note saying, what about women in the rabbinate? So,
okay.
And clergy, I guess. And again, you can't do everything, but of course, that's a major change,
right,
in contemporary Judaism.
Right.
In fact,
And
I was sitting at a sukkah in a traditional conservative synagogue, but very modern, next to a young man who was on, a Friday night with his phone out in the sukkah. So it was a very modern person. And my wife is a cantor, and he said, I've never heard of a woman being a cantor before. And I said, where are you living? I said, they're rabbis as well. But obviously, they've made a very big impact in the Jewish world through being in the clergy, when did that first happen again? It was the Reform movement.
So in Reform in 1972, in the conservative movement in 1983, and in Reconstructionist in 1974, and Sarah Hurwitz was ordained as rabbah, essentially, in the Orthodox movement in the first decade of the 2000s. So first of all, thank you to Linda Shanker for reminding me it's Amy Gutman, who was immediate past president of Penn. I wrote an earlier book called Women Who Would Be Rabbis. I've already written a history of the question, the century-long battle over women's ordination. So as a result, I didn't write about women rabbis at all in this book. I'd already written about them elsewhere.
Well, it seems to me that we have lots of topics to explore with you then, and I hope we'll have you back.
Thank you.
Very much appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody showing up after all the holidays for some good learning with CSP, and great questions, everybody. Good to see you all. Have a great rest of your week as you catch up, as some of you may be doing in your inbox, like I am. Professor Nadell, I really do hope you will send me some topics and recommendations. You threw out a lot of recommended books, and I tried to write them all down, so I will follow up this program with the link. Someone said, could we have the novelist's name? I don't know what book they're referring to, so I wrote down as many as I could.
You and I will email and I'll find it.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Be safe. We'll see you lots tomorrow, maybe next week. Take care. And if you're coming to Israel with me, time to get your nails done and your toenails done. Okay. Bye, everybody. Bye. Take care.